Welcome, everyone. I think everyone is starting in a minute. Thank you for participating in today's webinar. This webinar is focused on developing an engaged board of directors to advance equity. My name is Monica Arenas from Futures Without Violence, and I'm joined by my co-facilitator, Abby Larson, and also Vivian Baylor, who is supporting with technology. And we are honored to have Kenosha Davenport as the main presenter. Thank you everyone again for participating. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. You can put your name, agency, and location. And you may also submit questions through the panelists and also through the answer and question section that is located in below the chat. And also for accessibility, closed captioning is available. And thank you, Lori, for providing the captioning. And in the next slide, please, we have information about our supporter, the Office on Violence Against Women, and we're grateful for their support. This webinar is part of the SOS Institute project on organizational sustainability support, offering resources, technical assistance, and workshops. And the PowerPoint and handouts will be distributed to participants in the chat, and it will also be posted in the website. And we will move to the next slide, please. So Kenosha is the executive director of the Sexual Violence Center in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She has spent more than 19 years working in the gender-based violence movements and more than 7 years working in rural communities of Alabama and West Virginia. During her tenure, Kenosha has been able to develop and implement strategies to create sustainable organizations, and also developed and restructured compensations, philosophies, and packages that ensures that organizations are offering competitive market salaries and benefits. Throughout her career, Kenosha has served on many community and state level boards, and she's currently serving on the board of directors for the Violence Free Minnesota and the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, where she serves as the board president. And her bio is in the chat. I think we can put her Kenosha's bio in the chat. And in the next slide, please, we have the learning objectives for the webinar. So as a result of this webinar, you will be able to better examine your current board infrastructure and relationship with the executive director, and also an equity and racial justice lens, explore strategies for recruiting and engaging meaningful board members and that represent the community that you serve, and also apply organizational policies, bylaws, onboarding process, and systems that can generate and sustain an active and diverse board. So throughout the board, you'll have the opportunity to engage, peer exchange. We'll have a few scenarios, and we'll also have time for questions and answers at the end. So now we will start with a poll. We want to find out who's in the room. We have a great group of you that registered, so we want to see who's in the room, please. Check your role within your organization. See the responses yet. Okay, we have a great group of executive directors, 42% of the group here. program directors, well, the highest number of executive directors, and also board members. So that's great. And also administrative staff, program directors, program staff, and others. Thank you. Thank you everyone for participating. And next we'll move to another poll that focuses on how many members currently serve in your agency's board. Want to learn about your board members, please. Five or less, 6 to 10, 11 to 15, sure. Okay. I think we have 11 to 15 is the most that you have. 39% have a good number of board members. Then also 30% have 6 to 10 members, and 9% of you have 5 or less, and others are unsure. And also 17% have more than 15. Great, thank you so much. Well, this is a good overview of your group and your experiences. And now we'll turn it over to Kenosha. We'll also say a little bit more about yourself and start the presentation. Thank you, Kenosha.
Thank you so much, Monica. So really glad to see everyone here today. And so we're going to jump right into it. Again, my name is Kenosha Davenport. I'm currently the Executive Director of the Sexual Violence Center based in Minneapolis. And I'm also the board chair for the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, board treasurer for Violence Free Minnesota, and also NEMA, which is a local arts association. So, and that's the thing that we're going to talk about today, working with our boards and how to get to that place where we're meaningfully addressing racial equity. So let's get things started. Before we jump into it, I definitely want to cover the basics and make sure that we all have some ground understanding of how boards function. So I would like to talk about the two primary responsibilities of boards. And so a board of directors have two key responsibilities: taking care of the organization and taking care of itself. The board of directors take care of the organization by fulfilling their three legal duties, which is the duty of care, duty of obedience, and the duty of loyalty. The board takes care of the organization by ensuring that governing documents are adequate and relevant. The key governing document is the bylaws of the organization. The purpose of the bylaws is to guide the board's actions and decisions. Boards should take care when creating and revising bylaws to ensure that they are adhering to the state laws, and that they should consider writing them with a lens of equity. And we'll talk a little bit about what is equity and how do we build that into our board work. It is best practice to review those bylaws annually. So this is your reminder. If you haven't done so in the year, please consider getting that on the agenda to start the work to review those bylaws. We will spend some time talking about how that equity can be built into the bylaws. We know that in order for an organization to change, really begin to embrace equity, it must begin at the top. Let's look at ways in which boards can meaningfully embrace equity and promote it within the organization. One of the things is, as an ideal executive director and board relationship began with both parties working together to promote the best interests of their organization. While the ED's primary responsibility is to manage the company's executive team, the board is responsible for setting goals and working in partnership with the executive director, which includes supervision and support. So it's critical that the executive director and board relationship be built on a foundation of care, loyalty, and leadership. So I want you all to put into the chat. I'm going to give you just a minute or two to respond to this poll, which is which one best represent the board and ED relationship, either what you hope the relationship is or how do you see your current board and ED relationship. Oh, the poll is actually on the screen, so you can do it there. And then once we've had a few minutes, we'll take a look at the results, and then I'll talk about each of the pictures that is listed. So the question is, which one, if you had to look at the pictures, decide on which one would describe your board and ED relationship, or what you hope that board and ED relationship looked like. So it's a little abstract thinking there, or critical thinking.
And Kenosha, we have a question just to clarify.
Yes.
Are you going to share what your interpretation of the pictures
Yes.
is after? Okay.
I will. All right, it seems that most people selected D, and the second choice was C. So let's talk about each of these and at least my interpretation of those, and you can tell me if yours lined up or not. So picture A depicts a rowing team with two captains yelling or instructing the team to row in different directions. So can a board and executive director relationship function this way? The two captains represent the board president or chair and the executive director. The chair is instructing the board to row, and the ED is instructing the staff on how to row. Can organizations move forward if these two people are not in sync, or if the board is moving in a different direction than the staff? The answer is no. Much like the boat, board and staff was just spin in circles. Picture B, it is a several small errors, following one another, and then there's a pronounced bigger error. The errors are all going in the same direction. Who is represented by the large error is the question. Is it the board chair or is it the executive director? Who are the smaller errors? Seems like there may be an imbalance of power here. Are folks blindly following the big error? Imagine the big error is the ED. This happens when an ED recruits close friends and family to the board, or it can happen when you're in a membership-based organizations, similar to coalitions, where the bulk of the members are member programs. The relationship lines become blurred, and this can lead to the board not holding the executive director accountable. Imagine the big error as the board chair. The chair is making decisions, including day-to-day management of the organization. This can happen when the board does not have term limits. And so there can be some blurred lines as far as roles and responsibilities. Picture C, you see 4 ants holding up a stick to serve as a crossing for the other 2 ants. The ants holding the stick represent the board. They scattered ahead, discovered there was a gap on the journey, and found a resource to help the ED and staff continue the journey. A functional board is always looking ahead and down the road. Each member has a role and is contributing to the matter at hand. Picture D. Picture D is a pilot and co-pilot in a cockpit of a plane. The co-pilot is holding the navigational map. The role of the board is that of a co-pilot led by the board chair who serves as a navigator. The board charts the course for the organization through strategic planning. And that's another plug. If you haven't done your strategic plan, now's the time. The ED's role is to fly the plane, the organization, that individual is the pilot. Throughout the journey, the co-pilot checks the map to ensure that the pilot is heading in the right direction. And if there needs to be a course correction or additional resources, then the board is there to help the ED correct the course. Picture E, in this, and I know this was one of the ones that did not get as many responses, but it is a picture of a dog giving a goat a hug. The dog represents the board chair, and the goat, as always, right, the greatest of all time, is the executive director. The ED just shares all the concerns for the organization, and the board's response was a sympathetic statement, which is translated with the hug. While it seems very supportive, it is only in words and not in action. So I just like to have like a creative way of looking at what those roles and responsibilities should look like, how are they looking, and really give you, some tools and resources to address those. And so, is there going to be one way for board work to be done? No. The important thing is to have a engaged board. And so we'll talk a little bit about the board and ED relationship. So the relationship between the board of directors and the executive director must be established and understood by both parties. The board role is to govern, and the ED is responsible for the day-to-day management of the organization. The executive director expects the board to act and speak as one voice. And I saw that many of you averaged between 6 to 15 boards, which is a good, decent size. Anything more than 15, more than 12, I just feel like it's a really high number and can further complicate situations. But I do understand that some people did have larger boards, but it's critical that each one knows that they must act and speak as one. And that keeps staff, especially the executive director, not being pulled in 20 different directions, but moving in the one agreed upon direction. Directors, the executive director expects the board members to be engaged, informed, and prepared. I know a lot of time we talked about, we used to say working, we want a working board member, we work. And I'm asking people to consider using engaged, because sometimes board candidates can think working means that they're going to be behind the scenes, watching how the sauce is being made and being a part of how the sauce is being made. And that's not always a great a thing, and can lead to some confusion. And so for them to understand, utilizing the word engagement to mean, and really having a definition about what that engagement might look like, being responsive to emails, showing up for meetings, outreach events, serving as an ambassador of the organization. It is critical that board make timely decisions based on accurate information. The board and individual directors are accountable. And so we talked a little bit about the three legal duties of a board member: the duty of care, the duty of obedience, and the duty of loyalties. And so making sure that you're informed of those and actively doing those as a board member. The board views the relationship with the executive director as a partnership. And so this is their opportunity to partner with the executive director to really live out the mission of that organization. And then having a clear understanding between what is micromanagement and what is governance. a lot of time this gets lost in a lot of the boards, the governance piece, because they believe that hey, that entitles me to really overmanage or micromanage the executive director. So just making sure that as a board member, you know what that governance is, and that's providing that fiscal oversight, the programmatic oversight, and providing support as well as assessment of the executive director. And so it's important to understand the board's responsibilities to the relationship. So the board should support the executive director and commit to appropriate resources. Like the graphic show with the ants looking ahead, the board should be looking ahead. What are the opportunities coming ahead for this organization? What are the threats coming towards the organization, and what resources are needed to make sure that the organization is ready for that? And so that comes with them being engaged in a lot of work. As far as when I say work here, I'm talking about strategic planning, making sure that the government documents are in line, making sure that the agency is living out its mission and living out the core values. The board must respect the executive director as the head of the staff, that they're the person that's going to be taking charge of the day-to-day supervision of its core team, plus the other staff as well. Trust the executive director and the information is provided, having a clear understanding about the organization and how it functions. Because a lot of times in this work, sometimes you get someone from a corporate background and they want to set quotas. And so they don't understand that we're in the industry of serving people, and some numbers just aren't appropriate for us to track that ways. There's other ways in which to get to what it is that they're wanting to see. Ensure that they're providing fair and competitive compensation for the executive director, but also inquiring what might, when you're looking at the budget, have we passed salary increases for the program staff too as well, and really finding a way to determine whether or not the organization is offering competitive compensation. Being open and transparent, having, when you communicate, manage yourself and its interactions with the executive director, and assist the executive director in developing a succession plan. A lot of times people really get scared when they hear succession planning, but we should all have a succession plan, not only for the executive director, but for many of the positions in the organization and for our board members. Some boards will have the same chair for 10 years and then that chair leaves, and then everybody's like, well, we don't know what to do. Who do we have the chair now? And so having a succession plan that also addresses board recruitment. And so we'll talk about a recruitment as a way to move towards equity a little later in today's webinar. So the importance of a healthy board chair and executive director or CEO relationship. An ideal executive director and board relationship begins with both parties working together to promote the best interests of their organization. And you can see that the quote from Board Source, which is a great resource when you're doing board work or looking to for resources for your board. Board Source is a great one. So exceptional boards govern in constructive partnership with the chief executive, recognizing that the effectiveness of the board and the chief are interdependent. So while the executive director's primary role is to manage the executive team or the leadership team, the board is responsible for setting the goals and providing support to the ED. Executive directors must shoulder the burden of the public opinion for their organization's success and fails. Boards also act as an influencer with the executive director. So it is critical that the executive director and board relationship be built on a foundation of care, loyalty, and leadership. So let's do a quick scenario. And so I would like for you to share in chat. Here's a board challenge. Help. My board won't stop managing me. The board is not listening to me and wants me to do what they say. They keep piling on work and I'm desperate for advice. Imagine you're the chair of the board. How might you address this? All right, we see several answers coming in. Kristen says, bring you in, bring me in to train the board. Exactly right. Have a training on board roles and responsibilities. And that was by Kalia. Emily, I would consider bringing on a consultant to do board training. Third parties are sometimes game changers. I recall having a board that just could not get focused on their duty of taking care of themselves. I needed them to have a recruitment plan and so I brought in a third party consultant that we had worked with to do our strategic planning. And then it became not me constantly, like it didn't put us in a place of opposition. And so it brought in a third party who then could hold them accountable for coming up with the deliverables. So that's definitely a great thing to consider it if your budget allows for it. If not, then that's an opportunity for them to find the resources to be able to do it. Jennifer Johnson stated clearly, clarifying the roles. So making sure that they understand that. And Shannon, the board is to speak as one voice. So I would tell my board members that all communication for the ED needs to go through me. And Shannon, I'm assuming you're board chair. Elise, reestablish board roles and boundaries. And I can't say this is enough. It is super okay to revisit those annually. When you're doing your recruitment and new members are being brought on, it's a great topic for the next board meeting to talk about those roles and responsibility and expectations. Doing your board orientation training is another one as well. And so several people said roles and responsibilities. Address the issue directly with members and either train on the roles or the board chair lead the discussion. Definitely reaching out to your board chair as, you know, because this is supposed to be a partnership and that position is so critical. So who's in that board chair seat? So if you're in a board seat right now, know that that is a very critical position because the board is going to follow your lead. And so if your leadership is not strong, then the board is not going to be as strong as it can be. So having a clear understanding of your role as board chair is going to be critical. Thanks everyone for your responses in chat. If I didn't get a chance to read them all, but be sure to scroll up and check those out. And so some other things to consider is you want to focus on the tactics rather than the strategy. In the situation of board, the board piles on tasks rather than improving the strategy and letting the executive director determine the best tactics to address the strategy and improve the goals. One of the things that I always make sure that I do when working as a board chair, I always ask the ED, what supports do they need, or what needs to be addressed right now? Is there any board stuff that needs to happen that hasn't happened? Because it is the role of the board to take care of itself, meaning that if there's board issue, a board member not showing up, a board member overstepping, a board member, you know, whatever the example may be, it is the role of the board to address that and not the executive director, because that puts them in a very a hard place. So board members, some other thing is one of the things to remember, that as an executive director, you may have to take the opportunity to manage up, meaning really being clear with your board about what it is that you need from their interactions with the organization. And so some of the reasons why we see situations like this, micromanaging, is that the board have a lack of understanding about their roles and responsibility. And so that can be a recruitment issue or process. And so making sure that when people are doing their recruitment spills, that they're really explaining what it means to actively engage as a board member and what that doesn't mean, and really have some clear expectations for those members that you're recruiting, because it really begins with the recruitment. If your recruitment sale is like, hey, can you join this board? You really don't have to do much. Well, that's exactly who's going to show up, those people who don't really have to do much or want to do much. So make sure that you have that you're clearly, that recruitment strategy clearly outlines those expectations. And so just a little bit more about managing up. You want to get to know your board members, maybe a coffee meetup or a virtual connection call. This helps you to better understand who they are and what motivates them. And it also gives them the opportunity to know you. For those of you that have 15 plus board members, my thought or question would be like, how often have you had the opportunity to meet one-on-one with them, just to check in and see who they are, and allow them the opportunity to get to know you and how you're leading the organization. And then making sure that you bring to your board solutions versus problems. If you bring problems, you will receive their solutions. So if you know that you have a problem, try to brainstorm 2 to 3 solutions, and then helping them, then they can help you work through those 2 or 3 solutions. If not, you're going to have 15 new solutions to deal with the problem that you already kind of have an idea. So wrap that up really nice and tight in a bow, and then present it to the board. One of the things, the hearing organization I was with, they did not have a retirement plan. That was an issue for me, a huge issue. And it was one of my negotiation strategies. It's like, hey, if I come, you also have to give allow for us to have retirement, but I'm going to find all the things. I'm going to find the money, and I'll find the plan. And so I identified the problem, but then I brought forth the solution. And so wrapped it up nice and neat, and it was approved. Begin to know your board members. Who are your natural allies? Start there. The board and the executive director relationship should not be of opposition. Bring critical matters to your chair, or those that are already aligned with you first. They should be champions of the ideals to save you from being in opposition. And so if you're regularly meeting with your board chair, then setting them up or having conversations prior, so that when your new ideal is presented, that they already have buy-in. And so when you have a few that have that buy-in, then that limits the opportunity for there to be opposition. All right. So equity is creating a state and intentional opportunity for the community that we serve to have just and fair outcomes. We need to identify what is our role and how does our work intersect with the inequities? So racial equity is a process of eliminating racial disparities and improving outcomes for everyone. It is the intentional and continual practice of changing policies, practices, systems, and structure by prioritizing measurable change in the lives of people of color. Racial justice is a vision and transformation of society to eliminate racial hierarchies and advance collective liberation where Black, Indigenous, like Latinx, Asian Americans, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders in particular have the dignity, resources, power, and self-determination to fully thrive. So there is a clear distinction between racial equity and racial justice. Racial equity is the process for moving towards the vision of racial justice. Racial equity seeks measurable milestones and outcomes that can be achieved on the road to racial justice. Racial equity is necessary, but not sufficient for racial justice. There's more that has to be done. And so I know that many of you are familiar with the graphic. You know, the top left is equality. And then as you can see, they provide, which meant that everybody got one box, but that doesn't really fix the situation. Then equity, one person has one box and the shortest of them has two boxes. So that got us to equity. But liberation is removing the wall, and then everybody had access and could be able to see. And so just consider that as we begin to talk about racial equity as a core value for the organization. So for racial equity as a core value, you have to create an organization-specific definition. What does that mean in the terms of our organization? It's our core values, but how do we define it? So you have to have explicit equity goals, which can help create a culture of accountability to building equity through transformation and intentionality. A lot of times what we see is many organizations has the policy, but how do we move it towards action, right? Creating clear goals around that and having a very specific way to determine whether or not you've met that goal is going to be critical. Then you have to make sure that it's included throughout the organization, in your strategic plan, in the goals, and in the strategies. You have to develop an implementation plan for advocacy. What is the plan for policies? What are the plans for the programs? And also the systems that you're working within. You have to incorporate the budget and resources for racial equity. I often tell organizations, I can tell what you value by looking at your budget. And so figuring out how you can develop a line item, and you may have to start small and then build and add to that line item each year, but it needs to be in your budget, you know, whether that's in your professional development line or your board training line or consultant line. The bottom line is that it must be included in the budget. And then you have to begin to measure your results. If you make them what you consider a SMART goal, then you have to be able to measure those results and then sustain the change. And oftentimes people get hung up with like, there's so much to do, where do I start? You start with making some goal. And then if that doesn't work, then starting over again. Don't be afraid of the unknown or failing, because then that gives you an opportunity to continue trying. And then it isn't a one and done, right? Oh, we added it into our strategic plan and now we're all done. It's much more than that. It's actually, you have to keep your board engaged as well as your staff engaged. And so one of the ways to keep your board engaged in that is by, in the annual executive director and board assessments, And this is two types of assessment, not just the assessment of the executive director, but the board should be assessing itself, whether you're doing that individually, whether you're bringing in a third party to evaluate the board, or whether there's a subcommittee to do board assessments. You should consider including racial equity metrics. You also have to assess the composition of the executive board. Who's on the executive committee? What does those decision makers have? Because sometimes that executive committee can be where a lot of the power in an organization is at. And so making sure that the composition of those decision makers are, like what are the term limits, what are the demographics of those individuals, and, really making sure that it's a place where power is shared. Another way is the committee that there be a committee that is made up of board members and staff to review board policies and develop recommendations. And so bringing in staff to serve on a special committee or an additional committee that maybe is already addressing this, so that they are able to add their input, because this is all about a partnership, right? And so one of the ways in which to ensure that, but also is to also get staff involved. And then continue to build the board capacity at onboarding, and then at a minimum annually. I have seen boards that I've been a part of add an additional 30 minutes onto the board, and then they would spend time together as a board working on things that were about racial equity and just diversity, equity, and inclusion during that time as a board. Because a lot of time what happens is the staff of the organization gets a lot of training in that. And then you go and the staff is excited, the ED is excited, you go to the board and things are shot down because people don't understand why we're moving this way as an organization. What does race have to do with the sexual violence movement or the domestic violence movement? And the short answer is there's a lot of intersection there for many reasons, and a lot of historical reasons too as well. And so just keeping knowing that the board should also be working on this as well. And sometimes I think one of the questions that came in beforehand was like, how do we address this if our boards are at different levels? Like some people have done the work and they're prepared and they're ready, and there's some people who haven't done the work or who is not willing. Then that's where it is going to be critical that you have a strong board chair, because sometimes as board chair, we have to have difficult conversations with other board members. And so if they're not able to move forward with the organization, then they may need to be left behind, and your bylaw should have ways in which that should be addressed, or you just wait until natural terms allow to. So keep that in mind. Other ways is to include equity related topics in board meetings, discuss the implicit bias in decision making. So keeping the conversation going, not just the one time when the trainer comes in, but how do we keep this active? Is it on the agenda? What are the next steps in ensuring that our organization has equity as a core value? You want to acknowledge and manage the power dynamics that exist in the board. So being more transparent that yes, there is the power dynamics, and this is how we're choosing to share leadership in this space. Create group agreements to honor varying perspectives and address conflicts when they arise. So making sure that as a board, that the board has some mechanism or some kind of agreement as to what do we do when our opinions don't align or are in conflict with each other. One of the ways I've seen people do this is have written agreements, and they read those written agreements before each meeting. So as a reminder to people how we're choosing to engage with each other. And so one of the things that we can do is promote equity through the bylaws. So when an organization makes a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, it must be demonstrated through leadership, governance, policies, recruitment, the sharing of power and accountability. In order to cement the diversity, equity, and inclusion as a core value in an organization, it is to include DEI principles into the bylaws. Here are some ways that your board can address equity in its bylaws. One of the most overlooked part of the bylaws is the principal often. Often the board rushes to check the box of the section and move forward. Very little thought is given how the principal office may have some DEI consequences or create more barriers for historically excluded community. Please note that I used the word historically excluded and started marginalized because folks don't put themselves in the margin. Systems and institutions and organizations put them there. Instead of simply stating the city and the state, consider adding language such as we aspire to locate this corporation's principal office in an area that is consistent with the mission of this corporation, or we would consider the following factors in determining the principal office of this corporation. Another way is compensation. The board might consider including in its bylaws certain provisions regarding compensation, such as a statement that the corporation must pay all employees a fair and reasonable wage as to both the corporation and the employees. It's not a must, but it is something to kind of strengthen that language. Really taking the opportunity for the bylaws be the first place that you kind of address what is the compensation philosophy for the organization. And that's a fair and reasonable wage. And then you can go into more detail in other governing documents. Meetings. The board may want to consider how board members can participate in the meetings. Prior to the pandemic, I know many meetings were held in person. I know now we have more options because the pandemic has forced us to. And so if you're still one of those that is still not offering opportunities for people to participate in the board meeting in a way that isn't always in person, then that's something to consider about when you're thinking about accessibility, and especially if you're looking to recruit individuals. Like, for instance, if you're serving multiple counties, do you have representation from each of those counties? If not, then that may be an area of concern or a recruitment priority. And one of the considerations is the distance to the meetings. Are you gonna have meetings that move around, or are you gonna have a way for people to call in or Zoom in? And so the boards are often they're only representative of the seat of the principal county. And so you really have to look at ways in which to do that differently. So technology is a great way to move beyond the current seat that you're in. And then using the bylaws to express how board meetings can be held by conference call, Zoom, Team, or whatever new technology is being used, which will definitely allow for more participation from folks in rural areas and can lead to more representation from your service areas. Committees. Often the bylaws address the standard committees of the organization. And so many of you may be familiar with them. You have your finance, executive, fundraising, sometimes governance or board development. The board should also consider adding a DEI, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee as a standing committee. Again, by doing so, you are cementing the DEI into the foundation of the organization. Be sure to add the external parties, maybe a part of the committee, which will ensure that the committee is diverse. And then take some consideration as to having staff on that committee too as well. And so one of the tasks of the DEI committee might be charged with performing a DEI audit of the organization and other tasks to ensure that the DEI is more than a policy, because we have to move from policies and statements to how does this look in practice. So when you say that equity is a core value, my next question is, how's that demonstrated in an organization? What does that look like? What does that mean? And so to protect the DEI provisions in the bylaws, consider increasing the required number of percentage of directors necessary to approve an amendment to those specific provisions as well. And so if your majority, if it says, 45%, then maybe increasing that so that the board really gives it some critical thinking before deciding to remove that provision from the bylaws. The other area is officers. Most often, the corporate officers listed in the bylaws include the chair of the board or the president, the secretary, the treasurer. Our organization might consider requiring a diversity officer, which may be filled by a director or possibly an employee. This could also, another alternative is that the organization may require the vice president to assume the DEI oversight responsibility. Another thought is that co-leadership models are becoming more common and may offer opportunity for our organization to benefit from diverse perspectives in the management of the organization. And so we'll go into more details about recruitment. I encourage you to drop ways that your board have engaged or have encouraged equity in your organization into the chat to share with others what that may look like. But we'll continue. So of course, it's time for a scenario. Board challenge number 2. Our board is not representative of our community. We've had the same members for more than 5 years. How might I address this? So I'll give people a minute to post into chat how you will go about addressing this. All right, starting to see chats come in. Kalia says, submit bylaw proposals to include term limits. Emily revised term limits for board members. Vivian says, create term limits. Janet says, make sure you have term limits in your bylaws. Jessica adds, have a term limit. So it seems that most of you had understanding that term limits is definitely one of the ways, but then also looking at recruiting. Who are you recruiting? You've had the same members. Are you at your maximum? If not, let's get some seats filled, but being very proactive about how we fill the seats. And that's what we'll spend some time talking about next. Someone added staggering terms on and off. Open conversations regarding diversifying your board. Definitely just go ahead and pull the Band-Aid off and, and really talk about that, what may be a difficult subject, and so really encouraging the board to do that part of taking care of itself, which is recruiting more diverse individuals. And we'll talk about some tools and resources for doing just that. All right. So let's take another poll, and just really quickly, we want to know what other backgrounds are represented on your board. And so we have law enforcement, survivors, human resource, prosecutors, medical professionals, advocates, nonprofit organization, legal, or for-profit business. So tell us who makes up your board. And Monica, someone just put in the chat, Monica just put in the chat the sample. Well, maybe she did. Sorry about that. But in the resources, there is an equity and inclusion lens guide from the Nonprofit Association of Oregon. All right, let's take a look at the results. All right, it looks like 65% have legal, 61% for-profit business. Also tied for 65% is survivors. So that's good to see that survivors are represented on your boards. And then we also have 49% other nonprofit organizations. So it looks like a lot of diverse individuals are backgrounds are being served on your boards. Thank you for participating in that. So let's talk a little bit about board recruitment as a tool to advance equity. As you can see, there were several different backgrounds listed there on the poll. And so recruitments, effective boards work to compose a board structure that meets the needs of the organization. And it aligns with the organization's missions and vision. While working on board composition, boards need to assess their existing skills and capabilities in light of the skills and ability the board needs currently and over the next 3 to 5 years. So having a clear understanding of what are the current needs of our board, because that can shift from time to time, depending on where you are in the nonprofit cycle. Are you at the beginning stages of the board? Because then you may need more working board members with very specific skill set. But if you're in your 40th year, your ED has been there for several years, you may be in the adult stage of the nonprofit cycle. And so that board is going to have different needs. So making sure that your board is assessing the individual need of that organization at its point in the nonprofit cycle. So boards often need a host of talents, including legal, marketing, fundraising, human resource, finance, IT, strategic planning, and a whole list of other areas. It just depends on where your organization currently is. Is it looking for a new leader? So then you may be needing someone with more HR or recruitment skills. So it just really depends on where the organization is. Realizing that these needs can change over time. And so it's important for boards to review their needs over time and adjust the board composition accordingly. We've seen this play out so one of the things is understanding who's at your table, who is where you start. Making a list of what skills, what demographics, what experience that they're bringing to the board, and then taking a look at who's missing. What are some skills that you don't have as an executive director or a board member that you would like to see? You know, and it's not like, oh, we're in a legal snag, let's go recruit attorneys all of a sudden, right? It's having an understanding that anytime an organization or corporation is active, it's gonna have a need to mitigate its risk. So having an attorney on board may be helpful, but then also being very specific. Let's say that you were in a capital campaign to build your next shelter, your next principal office. Well, it may be helpful to have a real estate attorney and not so much the criminal attorney. So knowing that when you say attorney, that's a really broad category. And so when you're thinking about recruitment, you may want to get really specific. And then you want to assess who's missing. Are our board members diverse? Do our members reflect the community that we're serving? Take in where your board is now, and then taking a look at who's in the community and really match it up. If it's out of sync, then you have an obligation to work towards that. And then also include persons with lived experience. And then, as we've already said, is making sure that there's also term limit, because with that gives you the opportunity to bring in new individuals as well. And Monica just put in the board matrix. And so a board matrix is a great tool that you can use. So definitely grab that link, but it'll also be provided. And that matrix is a great way to assess who's currently here. But then in that sample tool, there are blanks in there. And that's for you to get really specific about, with your board, to determine who's missing. So just think about that when you're thinking about recruitment, and then really think outside of the box when it comes to recruitment. How are you recruiting? Is it just like, oh, well, we sent out an email. Okay, who did it go to? Well, it went to membership. Then guess who you're probably going to recruit? More membership. And if that's not what you're looking to do, then you have to look at getting that word out in as many places as possible. If you are looking for a very specific person, let's say an HR professional, then you may want to use a recruitment tool that send it out to the schools that have HR departments, or your local SHRM group. You may want to consider reaching out to folks on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is great, where you can put in the job description and then area, and it'll pull up a lot of people that match that criteria, and then you can decide how to go about reaching out. And then also looking towards your nonprofit organizations in your community that do like the nonprofit councils, reaching out to them and posting on their nonprofit boards, posting on job boards. I know that when I became the treasurer of NEMA, which is the Northeast Minneapolis Arts Association, I was looking for a board, what I was going to call my fun board to be on, that was something that I love, which is art. I'm not an artist by any stretch of the imagination, but I needed a fun board as a way to not always be so tied and connected to the movement. And so I chose the arts board. And so I went looking for that very specific thing. And, you know, one of the things that I know about a lot of nonprofits is that financial piece really get people stuck. And so that's why I wanted to be on the as a treasurer. And so I just Googled treasurer and boards at that nonprofit council website and chose NEMA as my fun board to serve on. And I know many of you was like, fun board, what's that? For me, it's fun. And so just really looking at different ways in which to do recruitment and get the word out. And then also with the board metrics, it's gonna be unique for each organization. So while we have provided you with the tool, you can delete what doesn't work for your organization and add what does. And then you're just making sure that it's aligned with the community, taking consideration the community and professional background, whether it's the CPA, legal, expertise, and skills. And do know that as you begin to diversify and you're having all these different backgrounds represented, that you also kind of be mindful of conflict of interest, you know, like recruiting a new CPA and then all of a sudden they want you to move all your things to their organization, and just have that really clear, like, we need you engaged, not necessarily a vendor. Keeping those expectations clear as you diversify your board. Then take a look at the demographics, religion, age, gender identity, ethnicity, lived experience, advocacy, relationships, connections. And so that's one great tool there, but you can find others at Board Source. They have a great board metrics there too as well. And so you want to assess what are the organization goals for the next 2 or 3 years. What are our needs? What are we up against? Or what opportunities do we have? And what board members may help us to kind of fill that gap. So based on those gaps and needs, you're gonna pay specific attention to making sure that you also have meaningful representation. All right. And so recruitment with the equity lens, you want to make sure that you're clarifying values in alignment with the board candidates, that you're kind of talking about those things up front, you know, we're an organization where equity is at our core values, and making sure that they're willing to support that. You want to make sure that you're also avoiding tokenism. So, you know, we're not just looking for a body, right, to say we check the box. Oh, we have Kenosha, so we have Black female, right? Check the box. You know, it has to go farther than that, you know, and really making sure that the needs that you're prioritizing doesn't then tokenize another individual. Making sure that you're valuing those lived experience. You want to highlight and value skills, knowledge, passion, life experience, non-traditional education, so that everyone has the opportunity to be a board member. And, you know, especially when you get to thinking about, okay, do I want experienced board members or non-experienced board members? You have to really have a good mix of both, with the ideal of really shaping and newer board members into what is then going to become the board members that have been on the board for a few years, right? And so that helps to create some stability on the board. So other considerations is, what does the application process look like? Am I having to submit a resume, a letter of interest, and like the whole kitchen sink in order to apply for a board, right? Is there a way to make processes simpler? Is there an application, a one-pager that I can fill out and upload my resume? You know, how much information is too much information? It's just like when we're thinking about diversifying the workplace. Are we asking too much, and what has that really gotten us, you know, thus far? Thinking about what are the barriers to serving. Is it the location? Is it childcare, you know, or maybe you have it at the lunch hour. All meetings are held at the lunch hour. And so there's never an opportunity, because there's a certain core group of folks who have the ability to work at a place where your lunch hour is a paid lunch hour and you can move about freely. So thinking about those things as well. Financial obligations and fund development. So the requirement, if your requirement is a give, $1,000, who might that exclude? Considering instead a give, get, or realizing that someone else may bring other unique talents and skills to the table. I'm not necessarily a board member that can bring you the Mackenzie Bezos of the world as a potential donor, but I am definitely the board member that can do a lot of your financial oversight and helping to right the ship anywhere in that financial arena, right? And so that, I can find you cost savings. And so that in itself is way more worth than any give you could have gotten out of me. Is some of my administrative tasks and duties that I'll bring to the board. And so having an understanding that having a give get may also create a barrier. And we talked about childcare, transportation, language. If we're talking about accessibility, and let's say part of your community was also deaf and hard of hearing, is it upon that person to bring their interpreter, or is that something the organization is willing to do? So how accessible are you willing to make your meeting so that people can participate? Or does everybody have to be hearing and speak English in order to be an effective board member? That's something for you and your organization to discuss. How might that look if we provide somebody with interpretation or make that available? And then making sure that board members have a clear understanding of the programs and staff connections and what's, oftentimes they may not be aware of who's in the organization and how they're connected to the organization. So making sure that they have a clear understanding. You want to reduce barriers, create better access, and look at what is the root. All right. For recruitment, you want to build a pipeline of potential board candidates. So maybe mentorship through an advisory board is always helpful. If you have a youth board, maybe at some point they become board members. If you have an advisory board, then maybe at some point they may join the full board. You want to start a list with women, BIPOC, trans, immigrant individuals that that would potentially be a great candidate for boards. You want to inquire about the needs for members to participate at the fullest. You want to, and we talked about the accessibility, you want to make sure that you cover those accessibility considerations as well. Other things on the recruitment journey is to identify potential board members. You want to network, mentor, engage as advisory, cultivate relationship, build trust, recruit, orientate, making sure that you have a robust orientation, that you aren't on board, that you aren't saying welcome to the board and then it's their first board meeting, but there's an actual orientation process where you're providing them with the board manual and you're talking them through those processes of what their roles and expectation. A board orientation, that is a great place to cover roles and responsibilities. And then also going over some key components of key events in the organizations. Developing a buddy system where board members who have been on the board for some time are mentoring the new board members as they come in. And so that either before a meeting or after a meeting, they're checking in to say, hey, was there something you didn't understand? Was there something you had questions about and you may have not felt okay to ask those questions? That's what board buddies or mentorships is going to look like. And you want to continue to build the capacity of your board members through training, whether that's the staff coming in training, ED doing training, the board doing its own training, or working with nonprofit councils or other third parties to do that. and then you want to involve and nurture. And so just continue to encourage your board to develop themselves. All right. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about challenges ahead. And I think, Abby, you had a couple of questions that came in.
Yeah, hi everyone. This is Abby with Futures. So we're going to move into our question and answer portion of the webinar now. We have a couple that we had planned in advance for you all, but I see that we've also had a couple come in the chat. So for time, let's go with the ones that you all asked, and please feel free to continue to submit those through the Q&A function. And then we'll ask the ones that we had prepared as well. So Kenosha, the first question is, how do you recruit a diverse pool of interested candidates while recognizing that the role and responsibility of the board is not accessible? For example, it's unpaid, the meetings are during traditional work hours, and sometimes requires a background check.
So one of the things is like the unpaid, unfortunately, that's part of the law. You know, nonprofit boards are not necessarily paid boards, but to address meetings during traditional work hours, one of the things that we don't want to do is create a system where we're changing board meetings for every time we have a new member join and say, I can't meet at this time. But you can, as an organization, look at, do lunchtime board meetings work? Has it historically worked? And then make an effort to take a look at those board times and maybe do a different time, you know, but it has to be set and kind of consistent. And so really take a look at your attendance policies too, because maybe it's not necessarily, sometimes you can have different attendance policies. So maybe they're able to go to all the committees because committee work is done at a different time or a different hour, whereas they can't necessarily make it to the actual board meeting. And so really get outside of the box of how we think about things in a, like it's all or nothing. And then maybe if it doesn't work for someone right now, maybe moving them into an advisory committee role that may have a different meeting time. And that way you're still utilizing their expertise and skills. And then as far as the background check, I think having a policy in and around background, what does that mean? What gets someone excluded? Is it a theft charge or is it a domestic violence charge? You know, which situations will invalidate somebody being a member, a board member, you know? And then we also have to think about at what point do we stop penalizing people for having a past? How long ago was that? And so have a way in which the committee that's charged with approving board members or the selection of the board members to really have that they're looking at things with that lens of equity, right? And so, you know, we know too in this movement or in the movements to end gender-based violence that a lot of survivors have charges too because of like the dual arrest. And so, yeah, now they have an arrest on us. So do you tell them no? Or do you have a way in which you're saying, okay, these are our hard limits, no. And these are like, okay, yes, and, or removing that from the overall big application and saving it for when after people have gotten their foot in the door and say, here, we're going to do a background check and here are the things we're looking for, and give them the opportunity to really discuss what their situations may be. And so I think there's a lot of flexibility when it comes to what that looks like.
Great, thank you. So we had another question earlier that was asking about how to increase representation on the board, specifically for people of color, when you are serving an area where demographically there's not many people of color who live there.
Yeah. So one of the things is making sure that they are aware that board recruitment is open to all, because sometimes if someone doesn't see themselves in the organization by the volunteers that are posted on social media, on the website, if staff, if they don't see themselves, then they may not see it as an opportunity for them. And so really thinking about when you say who's missing, and so you decide that you need let's say you needed a social worker. Well, some states also have a social work associations that are BIPOC, that are more specific, the Black Social Workers Association, that, unfortunately, due to like the history of our nation, they've had to have these separate entities in order to share, to ensure their particular trade too as well. And so reaching out to some of those organizations, I know that here in Minnesota, we have a Black Association of Social Workers. We also have a Native American Bar Association for Native American attorneys. And so if you're taking what your demographics plus your skill set, you can probably come up with an association of BIPOC individuals and send that recruitment letter over to them and allow them to disperse it to their members. And that way you're also getting a good fit with someone who's interested in your organization's mission.
All right, so the next question we have is liability insurance and indemnification at all connected to financial contributions? So if a board member contributes time and skills, are they covered?
Oh, now that's probably more of a question for your insurance carrier. But within any organization, you should definitely have that directors and officers liability, and as also that general liability. That way, anyone that's participating, they're still seen as a volunteer within your organization. And so the organization is still going to be liable for their actions too as well.
All right, so the next question is, how do you engage board members who are at different stages of their equity, inclusion, and anti-racism journey?
Yeah, and so I spoke a little bit about that and so the thing is to try to get an understanding of where your members are and really charting a course to where you want to be and by when you want to be there. So taking the time to say, we're kind of here as collectively as a group, and we're trying to get to this point, and really providing them with the tools and resources to get where they need to be. And then if you have people who are not just ready, then it may be time for them to step aside. And that's the part where the board taking care of itself really comes into play, is being able to have an honest conversation with your board chair and say, hey, Kenosha's just not where we need it to be, and how do we move her forward? How do we get her closer to buy-in? Because we're past the time to be there.
Mm-hmm. All right, so one more question. So how would you recommend, or what would you recommend ways to heal harm, restore relationships, and build trust among the executive director, the board, and the community while going through this equity process?
Okay, and so the question is, how do you, can you say that one more time?
Sure. The question is about how you can heal harms and restore relationships as you're going through this process of advancing equity.
Yeah, one of the things, the quote by Desmond Tutu says, Archbishop Desmond Tutu says, in order to heal harm, right, the first step is naming it. Oftentimes, we want to sweep things on the rug and pretend like they don't exist. And it's really important to acknowledge this is the harm that has happened within the organization. And here's how we are prepared to address that harm, and really doing the work to address and repair the harm that has been done.
Mhm. All right, well, thank you so much, Kenosha. I think that we can move on to the last couple of closing points that you had before we give a couple of other resources.
Okay, thank you. So just a few closing points. You want to make sure that you have a commitment to racial justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion, not just a statement, not just a policy, but a true understanding of that. And so having a shared understanding of inequities and root causes is going to be critical. A shared understanding creates an opportunity for a reckoning of the truths. The board of directors need to be informed on anti-oppression and anti-racism to ground the agency's policies, its practices, and its governance in a way that is an intersectional approach. The diversity of the board should reflect that commitment. If the board of directors don't have that framework or have not practiced it, then they must develop a comprehensive plan to move themselves further in on the framework. And so you want to know the community that in the organization that is being served. You want to discuss and engage in fiduciary duties with a lens, equity lens, and then you want to build policies and structures that it addresses equity as well. And that's all I have for you.
And can you go to the next slide?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Kenosha. We really appreciate having you here with us today and going through some of these strategies. There's been a lot of information, so just know that this will be available on our website, including a recording and a copy of the slides with additional resources. Before you go, I wanted to share an opportunity that we have coming up through the SOS Institute. It's our Professional Leadership and Advancement Network program that's going to be starting in February of next year. We have an info session coming up on November 9th, which is the same day when the applications will open up. The plan is a virtual 7-week course and ongoing cohort that supports executive directors in their role to effectively manage, lead, and strengthen their organization's infrastructure and culture. It's really an opportunity to engage with other survivor serving organizations across the country and foster those leadership skills rooted in values of the anti-violence movement, including a lot of the equity principles that Kenosha discussed with us today. So we'd really highly recommend, if you're interested in applying, that you attend the informational session in a couple of weeks. We're going to be talking about an overview of the SOS Institute in general, which is also what we're hosting this webinar through today. We'll also have an introduction to our lead facilitator, Dr. François Booker-Drew, as well as going through some of the eligibility and application requirements, and then just some more general logistical information about plan as a cohort and what you can expect from the program. So please do register if you're interested, and you can check out our SOS website for more information. And then we can go to the last slide. Just to thank you all so much. We are going to share an evaluation link in the chat so that you can share your feedback with us. We really do take it into consideration for future webinars. We're happy to follow up with any questions that went unanswered today, so please feel free to send those ahead as well. The SOS Institute offers technical assistance, so if you would like some more one-on-one support with anyone on our future staff, or if you'd like to be connected with some of our SOS faculty, we can talk about that as well if you just reach out to us through our email, learning@futureswithoutviolence.org. And yeah, before we close up, I just wanted to once again thank Kenosha for presenting this information for us today. She really covered a lot, so we really appreciate her for going through all of these different complicated and sometimes complex ways of advancing equity on your boards. And yeah, we invite you to reach out with any questions that you have, and please feel free to fill out that evaluation link. Thank you so much.